All right, so we are looking at section 2.1 for our science. We're going to start looking at climate. Now, climate's a word we use all the time, but it's basically, climate is just the general conditions of the temperature and the pressure of a region. So we have factors that will affect the temperature and pressure of a region. Let's look at temperature first. Temperature is going to be affected by the latitude. Now, the latitude is the distance from the equator, and we've already worked with these. Remember, 30 degrees latitude were those the horse trade winds, or the horse latitude, sorry, because that's where they would throw the horses overboard when they lost the wind. So our equator is at 0 degrees. That gets the most direct sunlight. And our poles are at 90 degrees. That gives the least direct sunlight. And we actually already talked about that as well, because this direct sun, that heats things up when we were talking about those air currents that occur on the earth, creating those global winds. And so if you are by the equator, you have the most direct sun, it's going to be hotter. When you're up and you have the least direct sunlight, it's going to be colder. The next thing that will affect the temperature of a region is the elevation, meaning how high up are you? And this is measured from sea level. So sea level is always given 0, okay? And as you go up, a couple things happen. When you go higher up in elevation, you're going to have fewer air particles. If you have fewer air particles, that means there's less pressure. If there is less pressure and fewer air particles, that means that the air is less dense. If that air is less dense, that means it will hold less heat. So as you go higher and higher in elevation and the air becomes thinner, it will hold less heat. That's why high in the mountains, even in the middle of summer, it's going to be cooler than down at sea level in the same location. So you will have a difference in temperature based on your elevation. The other large factor, another large natural factor, these are all natural factors for temperature in a region, are the ocean currents. Now, we didn't really talk about the ocean currents, we talked about air currents, but the ocean currents are affected exactly the same way because they're both fluids. So where you have an area where there's a lot of heat, that warm water rises just like the warm air rose. And when the warm water rises, it pushes cold water down to the bottom, and it creates this cycle. Okay, so these ocean currents are just like our wind currents, where they flow through. We have our jet stream and all of that. So these ocean currents are rivers of different temperature water that's flowing through the ocean itself. And there is a nice graph, I believe it's page 74, and if not, you can find it close to there, where they show you all of these different ocean currents, which hopefully you've looked at before in a previous earth science class. If you are in land that is close to a cold current, well, your temperature is going to be colder, and that should make sense, just like a refrigerator. You bring something cold by, it kind of cools the area. And these cold ocean currents, these are all the currents that are flowing towards the equator. Okay, so these are the cold water coming from the poles down to the equator. If you are by land that is next to a warm ocean current, that land is going to be warmer. It's going to be higher temperature. These currents, the warm ocean currents, these are the ones that are flowing from the equator up towards the poles, because they're being heated at the equator because of this direct sun, and they flow up towards the poles. So make sure when you take a look at your book, yes, I do still expect you to read your book, make sure when you take a look at your book, you take a look at the graph that goes in here. I will expect that you understand and know the major ocean currents, okay, at least by name. And you can tell me which part of those ocean currents are going to be colder and which ones are going to be warmer, because you're going to know that because of their flowing towards the equator or away. Now, the other major thing to determine what climate is, you have your temperature. There's our three things that affect it. The other one is the precipitation. Now, precipitation, remember, that's stuff that falls out of the sky. We just got a whole bunch of it now, and I know it was a week too early, and everybody was very upset about that. But it can be snow, it can be rain, it can be sleet, all of those types of precipitation we've already talked about. Now, two major things affect the precipitation in an area. One of them are the prevailing winds, which we just talked about. Remember our prevailing westerlies, the horse latitude, the doldrums, all of the global winds. Okay, now Here we go. If the wind is warm, it will hold more moisture. So the warmer the wind, the more moisture it will hold. If that air is warm, remember we already said warm air rises because it's less dense. Well, when it rises, what happens to the temperature? Well, it cools down, and when it cools down, boom, you get precipitation. So the direction of these winds are going to affect how much moisture you start with. So if you're coming off like an ocean, you're going to have more water in the air. So if you have a warm wind off the ocean, then it cools, you're going to get precipitation. If you have a whole bunch of wind, but it's coming off of land, you're not going to get any precipitation. A major example of this would be the Sahara Desert. The Sahara Desert takes up the top part of the African continent. And it's a huge desert, huge expansive desert, and it's right next to the ocean. So you would think that you would get some precipitation. But the wind that comes to the Sahara Desert comes off of the large landmass of Europe. And there's not a lot of water for it to pick up. So it flows over and it's dry. So even though as it flows over, it's going to be dry, but the Sahara Desert then warms it up. Well, that wind goes out into the ocean, picks up some water, and it dumps it somewhere else. But the Sahara has this large wind, but the wind is dry. The second thing that affects our precipitation are the existence of our mountain ranges. And if you have a mountain range, remember, mountain's just a huge hill, and you have wind that is coming along, and it encounters these mountain ranges. You're going to have two sides of the mountain. You're going to have the windward side, that's the side that the wind is hitting, all right? And then you have the leeward side, which is the back side of the mountain. Well, what happens when the wind hits these mountain ranges? Well, just like wind going over your car, it comes in and it's forced to go up and over because it can't go through. So the wind comes in and it forces it to go up. Well, what happens when you raise your elevation? Right? When you raise your elevation, the temperature gets colder. All right. So the wind comes in, it's forced to go up, it cools. Well, what happens when the wind cools? Well, it rains. So this windward side of a mountain, especially if that wind is coming off of an ocean, is going to be lots and lots of precipitation. Well, once it gets over this mountain, it's now cooled. It's lost all of its water. There's no more water left. So now on the leeward side, it's dry. And over here in the U.S., we have a large mountain range over here called the Sierra Nevadas. And these Sierra Nevadas, the wind comes off of the ocean. So over here is our windward side of our mountain range. It gets forced up over the mountains, which means there's lots and lots of rain over in this area, right? So California and all of those nice areas. But the leeward side, this ends up becoming very dry. And we know that this is what we call the Great Basin. And this Great Basin extends from Washington State out into Nevada and Utah. This was the great deserts that the settlers had to cross when they were trying to hit California for the gold rush. And so they would get in their wagons, and it's right in this Great Basin that they'd have a lot of trouble because there wasn't a lot of rain coming from there. So the climate here is greatly affected by the fact that there were mountain ranges that they had to cross. All right, so I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, and work hard, and I miss you, and we'll see you soon.